Good evening, everyone. My name is David Dawson. I'm Director of the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes, and it's my pleasure to be chairing this session this evening. Thank you for hosting this talk, hosted by the Wessex Museums Partnership. We're a partnership of Dorset, Poole, Salisbury and Wiltshire Museums. Our mission is to support our museums to connect, inspire and add value to people's lives. Our online Wiltshire in the Red exhibition use objects from our museums to tell the stories of endangered species and biodiversity loss. We'd like to thank Strategic Solutions for supporting the exhibition and this series of talks. These online talks are free, but donations are very welcome. In these challenging times, we need your help more than ever. You can find the link to donate on our emails or on the website at wessexmuseums.org.uk/donation. And with that, if I could ask our speaker, Matt, if you would turn on your camera and if you'd like to set up your presentation. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Matt Pitts from Plantlife, who's going to be talking to us tonight. His job title is Meadows Advisor for Plantlife. And I gather you've been advising people for over 20 years on how to set up meadows. So I think you just about know what you're talking about.
I hope so. Yeah, get to see lots of interesting places, so it's great.
Fabulous. Okay. So with that, I'd like to, if you're happy, if you're ready to go, if you'd like to get started. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you very much, David. Yeah, it's lovely to be here this evening, and thanks to everybody for tuning in. Is that the right word? I know I was interested to see that somebody's sitting in their garden. I think that was noticed there on the chat, so that's very brave of you. I'm actually down in Devon at the moment looking at meadows across the edge of Dartmoor, and it's a little bit chilly down here. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background to the charity I work for called Plantlife. Hopefully some of you might have heard of Plantlife. We're a national plant conservation charity, and we work for the conservation of plants and wild plants and fungi. We've got a number of nature reserves that we manage up and down the country. Quite a lot of those are wildflower meadows. Woodlands and other habitats as well, but most of them are being protected because of the plant interest in them. We also have a specialist team that is spread across the country, advising and supporting plant conservation across the UK. So I'm going to talk a little bit about meadows today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's happened to meadows. I'm going to talk about why we've lost so many meadows. I'm going to talk about why meadows are special as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more positive work that people have been doing to try and recreate and restore meadows, and something that you might be able to do yourselves as well, the potential to create wildflower areas in much smaller spaces as well. I'm not sure how many people are aware, but we've lost approximately 97% of our species-rich wildflower meadows in the last 70 to 80 years, which is quite staggering, really, if you think about it. And I'll explain a little bit more about why we've lost so many of those as we go through the talk. Just wanted to give you a little bit more context as well. So Plantlife as a plant conservation charity has been working on helping people to restore meadows for probably at least, I don't know, 10 to 15 years now. We've had a number of quite big publicly focused projects working with landowners, individuals, communities to try and help them and advise them about restoration of meadows. One of the fairly high profile projects was a Coronation Meadows project. Within that project, we helped people to restore meadows across the whole country. So the idea was to restore a new meadow in every county or recreate a new meadow. And we've also been involved in other lottery funded projects as well, where we were the lead partner in the Save Our Magnificent Meadows project, which again was a large scale funded project where we were helping lots of different people from different walks of life to recreate and restore wildflower meadows. And we've currently got another meadows project going on in Wales at the moment, where we're again working with individuals, communities, landowners to try and help them and support them to recreate and restore wildflower meadows. And actually I'm down here in Devon working with a community meadows group called More Meadows. Again, we're working with them to help guide and support them to recreate and restore wildflower meadows. So there's a lot of work going on to recreate meadows at the moment across the country. I just wanted to touch on really the reason why I suppose we think meadows are important. I suspect most people have seen wildflowers in the countryside, and clearly there's an aesthetic value to meadows, and a lot of people really appreciate seeing wildflowers in the summer. So, you know, that's definitely a sort of cultural and a sort of aesthetic value that we put on these places. One reason why they're considered important. But it's all these other connections as well. So it's the aesthetic, but it's also the connections into wildlife that make meadows very special and really important as well. Clearly really good places for insects and invertebrates, and great for pollination. Butterflies as well. So yeah, wonderful. So it's that connection really between plants and other animals that use meadows that really make them valuable as well. Just thinking about why we've lost meadows and where we still have some meadows. Often meadows or wildflower areas tend to survive, often around old buildings, interestingly, particularly churchyards. If you imagine, a lot of our churches are up to 1,000 years old, and the graveyards around those churches are also often fairly old and ancient grassland. So we sometimes have really, really good survival of wildflowers in and around churchyards, and very much depends on how that churchyard might be managed as to what kind of wildflowers you might see in the local churchyard. But it's a really good place still to see wildflowers in the countryside. Another place that we have survival of wildflowers and meadow type communities is also some of our road verges across the country. And Plantlife's been working hard over the last few years to try and encourage councils, local people to think about the management of road verges for wildflowers. And we've got an ongoing campaign where we're working with communities and local authorities to try and get them to think about the way they manage their verges and change the management to try and encourage more wildflowers. But these are the sort of places where you can still see survival of wildflowers up and down the country. And also in I guess other wildflower meadows are quite isolated and scattered across the landscape as well. So what makes a meadow? So it's a combination of things, really. And you can see on the screen here, all of these things, I guess, combined is what ends up making a wildflower meadow. Clearly, the soil is really important. That will kind of determine the kinds of plants that will grow best in any location. And that will determine the kind of wildflowers that you'd expect to see in a particular area, in a particular meadow. The management as well is the other key thing. So the way that the land is managed has a huge bearing on how well the wildflowers will or won't do in an area. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through in terms of what people can do in their own space about creating and restoring, making areas for wildflowers. So just going back to thinking about soil, I mean, a lot of people, I think on this this webinar are somewhere based in Salisbury area and around sort of Hampshire and Wiltshire. That's quite a chalky landscape. So the chalk gives rise to a range of wildflowers. Some of those particularly specialists, particularly some of the interesting orchids that we get on the chalk. In fact, some of our most flower-rich meadows survive on chalk and in chalk landscapes. In some places, you can get up to 40 wildflowers in a square metre, which is pretty impressive. And that's on those kind of isolated pieces of land that are still being managed as wildflower meadows, and sometimes in those churchyards, sometimes on road verges as well. Through Hampshire and Wiltshire, you can see amazing displays of orchids and other wildflowers on those chalky sides of the roads. In other parts of the country, we've got different soils. So we've got maybe heavier soils, kind of clays and loams, and then we get a different suite of wildflowers that will survive and flourish on those kinds of soils there. So in this photo, you can see red clover there in the foreground, and another plant that probably anyone who's looked into this is quite familiar with is a yellow rattle, which again, you can see there in the background of this photo. And we've also got bird's foot trefoil as well. So those are quite common wildflowers on those clay and heavier soils. And again, they're the kind of more neutral soils where we get this kind of suite of plants. So just turning back and thinking about why we've lost so many meadows, why we've lost that 97%. One of the biggest reasons for loss of meadows has been changes in farming practice over the last 70 or 80 years. If you turn the clock back to the beginning of the last century, machines like this didn't exist. People were still using horses. and meadow management was done in a very different way. In fact, it was done by hand, and it was done much more slowly. And in more recent times, farming practices have changed, bigger machinery has come in, and we've started to convert from haymaking to silaging, which is a practice that's done much earlier than haymaking. The grass is collected or cut and collected all within normally about 24 hours, and it's normally done in May and early June. Most of the wildflowers that were historically in wildflower meadows will be flowering in June and early July, and won't have set their seeds by the time this kind of work happens. So a reason for the demise of some of these meadows is this much earlier cutting and this change from haymaking to silaging across the wider countryside, which obviously led to the decline in meadows. Another big reason for decline was, again, the way that land was being cultivated. So at the beginning of the century, I suspect a lot of our meadows and hay meadows were more species rich than they are now. With the advent of modern agricultural techniques, we start to get land being sown and reseeded, so grass fields being resown with very productive grasses such as the one here on the screen, which is a ryegrass and clover. So in a modern agricultural field, you 10 varieties of grass and maybe one flower, so maybe white clover. So a very, very limited number of wildflowers. And the reason they're doing that is because they're growing high productivity food. So it's again another change in farming practice. So in effect, meadows that were species rich were ploughed and they were reseeded with a very limited number of plants, of grasses, and that then led to the loss of these very species rich wildflower meadows. Again, this is another factor, the use of artificial fertilizers. So the ryegrass in the previous slide there really enjoys artificial fertilizer. It sucks it up and it grows very, very quickly. And of course, that means there's no space for any wildflowers in a meadow. So the combination of reseeding, use of artificial fertilizers, and the changing of haymaking to silaging, and the use of herbicides as well to remove the broadleaf plants. Really, I mean, those are the kind of main factors, I guess, for the demise of wildflower meadows. And it's really only with the kind of, I guess, the benevolence and the foresight of some landowners across the country that we still have some of those more species-rich meadows surviving in the landscape today. Another reason for decline, and this is probably more relevant to today and to now, is increasing development, often around the edge of villages where you may have meadows that may still have some survival of wildflowers in them. And there's increasing pressure around our towns and villages, and sometimes housing developments get built on what are potentially quite nice wildflower meadows. So yeah, they are under significant threat, or at least have been in the past, and I think still are even in today's modern landscape. So yeah, I'm going back to why you get survival, I guess. I mean, in a churchyard, and again, it's because that land has fundamentally been grass for a long, long period of time, associated with the buildings, and often the way that those bits of land are being managed, and the fact the land hasn't been artificially fertilized, it hasn't been reseeded in most churchyards. Most churchyards at some point were probably a field, and that field becomes enclosed inside the graveyard, and the wildflowers then survive with it, and they survive through the management of those churchyards. So yeah, a good place. Another place often where wildflowers survive is sometimes around some of our older houses as well. Again, this is a 1930s house, lots of those scattered across the countryside. And of course, often they were built on green fields on the edges of towns and villages. And sometimes those green fields end up getting enclosed into the gardens of those houses. So you often find that you have really good survival of wildflowers sometimes around older houses and older properties. And the older the property, the more likelihood of really nice wildflowers surviving. But of course, typically a lot of those areas just get cut by people as lawns. And so you may not even be aware that there's a huge number of wildflowers just sitting in your lawn. So yeah, so lawns is a really interesting place to think about wildflowers. And I suspect most people that have got a lawn, you know, the typical lawn on the right hand side there, cut every couple of weeks. Often really no opportunity for wildflowers to flower. Often not even necessarily very obvious that wildflowers are in those lawns. Also public green spaces as well. Huge amounts of our public green space are being cut on a regular basis every few weeks. And again, our verges often are cut sometimes at the wrong time of year. So wildflowers in these kind of spaces often don't get an opportunity just to kind of show themselves. So it's interesting. One of the things that we often encourage people to do in a garden context is actually just to stop mowing the lawn, which is potentially a really good way to see what you've got growing in your lawn. So yeah, I mean, that's something that pretty much anyone can do. Is just literally stop mowing through the early summer. And then kind of see what comes up in your lawn. And I suspect a lot of people will find that they probably have quite a lot more wildflowers than they might think. The image on the left there as well is kind of an illustration of some of the wildflowers that will survive really well in a lawn, but they may not be flowering because the lawn is cut so short. But as soon as you just relax the mowing for a few weeks, you'll find that suddenly these plants that just look green will suddenly start to produce flowers. So we've got South Heel there, the blue flower in the middle, and then bird's foot trefoil, and then the white clover on the left-hand side. Yeah, so as I was saying there, I mean, lawns are often the remains of old meadows, and often around these old houses, you know, there's often good survival of these wildflowers that just aren't visible because of the constant cutting that happens. And again, most lawns, I mean, I'm not sure how many people spend a lot of time and effort on their lawns, but quite a lot of people don't. They just simply cut them, so they don't feed the lawn, they don't fertilize, or they don't use other chemicals on their lawn. So again, that's often a good place for wildflowers to survive, and yet often they're not flowering, so they're not known about. Another area, again, that has the potential in gardens is about leaving grass long. There are lots of opportunities in grass, you know, to allow other flowers. So some flowers do very well in short turf, as I just described, but also some of our wildflowers do much better if the area is left much longer. And you think about how a typical hay meadow would be managed. The grass would be left long. In fact, it would be left to grow all the way through the spring until about the middle of the summer, typically till mid-July. So some of the wildflowers that we have in the countryside today do very well in that kind of management. So less cutting and probably just one cut a year. So typical flowers that would grow well in long grass would be something like knapweed and the oxeye daisies, which you typically see again along the road verges that aren't constantly being cut. And again, you would see those in wildflower meadows in the countryside that are being managed more as traditional hay meadows. But, you know, clearly an opportunity to leave areas in a garden, in fact, and you could do a similar kind of thing. So yeah, there's two really ways of thinking about it. So if you've got a small space and you want to think about the way you might want to manage it to try and encourage more wildflowers, you've got managing the short grass or managing the long grass. So managing short grass is really about reducing the amount of time you cut your meadow or your lawn. So rather than cutting every week or every other week, it's reducing the cutting time to something like maybe every 4 to 6 weeks during the summer. And I'd be very surprised if you did that. You'd be surprised how many wildflowers you potentially would see in a lawn, particularly if it's a lawn that hasn't been reseeded or hasn't been turfed. And it's just quite an old lawn around an old property. So that's something that we really would encourage people to try and have a go at. So yeah, a good example of what you might see. So yeah, I mean, the other option is, again, thinking about leaving your lawn uncut. Again, now is a good time to start thinking about stopping cutting your lawn. In fact, if you stop cutting it a bit earlier, maybe the end of, or in fact, you probably just wouldn't cut at all until later on in the summer. And again, that would allow the grass to grow longer, and you get some of these plants that grow much taller, potentially in a lawn. And again, they may not be visible because of the cut constantly being the lawn constantly being cut. So that's another option as well. Many people have got lawns or small areas maybe in a garden that they maybe if they leave it for a season and see what appears, and find that there's very little in there, there are ways and means of trying to bring wildflowers into a small space. And the principles that we would apply are really the same principles you would apply if you were doing it on a farm. We're just applying it in a slightly different way in a smaller space. So yeah, the first thing to do really, if you're thinking about doing this, is to understand what you've got there, and as I said, the best thing to do is to leave that area completely alone, and not do anything for a season. And then if you find there's very little in there, then you've got the opportunity to start thinking about how you might introduce wildflowers into a meadow. So you need to think about the soil type before you do that, and most people possibly might know what soil they're on depending on where they live, but there's ways and means of finding out about soil type. You can go online and you can search for soil types in your area, and there are various online free sources of maps that will show you the soil type in your area, and you can also test the soil as well. So, and the pH is the thing that you're trying to understand, and that will determine the kinds of plants that you might want to try and establish, the wildflowers you might want to try and establish in your garden. So once you've thought about that, you need to also think about how you're going to manage your wildflower area. And as I said, there's the option to do that cutting, maybe 3 to 6 weeks over the summer, or the other option is to just do a one cut, and that would be after all these flowers are finished flowering. So in effect, you're kind of mimicking or recreating how a hay meadow would be managed, but just doing it in a much smaller space in the garden. So yeah, I mean, I think we would definitely advocate the idea of leaving a meadow, a grass field, not field, sorry, a lawn, and seeing what comes up as a first starting point before thinking about doing anything else. And if you've done that and there's very little coming up, then you've got the option of starting to think about how you might introduce seeds. And I'm going to show you now. This is quite a useful tool for trying to help you to introduce wildflower seeds into a garden context. This is a garden scarifier, and these can be hired quite cheaply from hire companies. For a weekend, you can hire one of these for probably around 30 to 50 pounds. And what they're really good at doing is they're good at kind of pulling out all the old grass and the thatch. So if you're trying to sow wildflowers into an existing lawn, which we would generally advocate rather than completely starting from scratch, particularly around old properties, because you may already have some wildflowers in that area, as we said, you're always better to start and work with what you've got rather than completely starting again. And this is exactly the same principle that we would use if we were trying to convert a farmer's field that was already grass into a more flower-rich meadow. We would just be using much bigger machinery. So the idea is that you remove all the grass as much as possible, and then we use this machine to remove all of the dead grass and the thatch that builds up in lawns, so that we're trying to create some bare ground. And you can see the little grooves on this photograph is where the soil is actually being exposed across the lawn. And we need to expose bare soil if we're going to try and introduce wildflowers. A lot of people buy a packet of wildflower seeds and they just simply throw them on their lawn. And we often have calls from people saying, well, we got some seeds and we sprinkled them on the lawn, and we looked for them the next year, and then we looked for them the year after, and of course nothing ever happened. And typically the reason nothing happens is because those seeds just sat on the surface of the lawn, and typically lawns have this kind of thatchy dead grass in the bottom, and of course the seeds never actually made contact with the bare soil, and they were just dry and sort of sitting on this thatch, and of course they just never germinate. So using one of these machines is quite a good way to try and remove some of that thatch and create some just very slight bit of loose soil on the surface that you can then spread your wildflower seeds onto. So really quite an effective way of doing that, actually, using a scarifier. So yeah, going back to the kinds of wildflowers you might want to try and establish in a lawn. I mean, the typical kinds of soils you're going to get around the Salisbury area, and through Hampshire and through Wiltshire, I mean, it's potentially going to be limey. So that's the sort of soil that's kind of affected by the chalk underneath. Or it might be more on the neutral side, depending on if you're on slightly heavier ground or if you're on clay. So just there's a list of some different plant types or wildflower types that might be more suited to those different soil types. You can also buy pH testing kits from online retailers and garden centres as well, which will give you a good idea about the soil pH. So a neutral soil would typically have a pH of around 7. And then a limey soil would be much higher than that, so it would be 8 possibly. So it's a good way to kind of understand a little bit about the soil chemistry, and then you can kind of match that to the kinds of wildflowers that you would hope to try and establish, or that at least would do best on that kind of soil type. Plantlife as an organisation, as a charity, we actually sell wildflowers, and we sell wildflower mixes that you can buy. You can buy online on our website. And again, we sell them based on different soil types. So if you can find out a little bit about the soil type that you have, you can then try and match the wildflower seed to the soil type that you have in your garden or in the space that you'd like to try and establish wildflowers. So that's a good thing to do. So yeah, understanding a little bit about your soil is really good, because that can help to choose the right mix that's most suited to your site and to your soil. Yeah, it's a really good thing. So I'm going to just walk you through now the work we would do to sow. So we've done the preparation work, which is scarifying the lawn to remove all that old dead grass and the thatch, and just to create a tiny little bit of loose soil on the surface. And the scarifier does that really well. But there are other things. I mean, some people will just get their mower and they will basically mow very, very, very short. And you can keep mowing and you can keep lowering the mower down, down, down. And eventually the mower will get so short that it's almost kind of scalping the grass. And you'll end up creating bare patches by doing that. The key to doing all this, of course, is that you need to remove all of the material that gets pulled out of the grass. So the scarifying pulls out a lot of dead grass, that all needs to be raked away. And again, if you're mowing to try and get the grass really, really short, again, is having the box on the mower and just collecting all of that grass and all that dead grass that you managed to cut out of the lawn. So both of those will work quite well at creating this bare ground before you sow. But that is really the key to the success of making wildflowers work, really in any space, is getting some bare ground available. And of course, this is the best way to do it if you've got an existing area of grass. The other plant that people probably have heard of is yellow rattle as well. Yellow rattle is one of these plants which is semi-parasitic, which basically means that it kind of taps itself into the roots of the grass. It won't kill grass, but what it does do is it slowly makes grass less dominant. The grass is suppressed by the yellow rattle. And so if you can sow yellow rattle in a grassy area, that often is a good way to help you try and get more wildflowers going in an area that's quite dominated by grass. So if you've left your patch for a whole season, whatever it is, wherever you're thinking about creating wildflowers, and you find that there's very few wildflowers in there, and then you decide, I'm going to try and establish some wildflowers, and the area is mostly grass, often yellow rattle is quite a good starting point to try and suppress that grass. And once yellow rattle gets established over 2 or 3 years, it will really make a big difference, and you'll find that you start to get gaps, and other wildflowers potentially could be sown into those gaps. Quite a lot of the meadow mixes that you can buy, and I think some of the mixes that we sell on our website have yellow rattle mixed in with other wildflowers anyway. So that's a really good plant to have and get established. And yellow rattle is quite a flexible wildflower, so it will grow on neutral soil, but it'll also grow quite happily on limey soil as well. So quite a lot of these wildflowers are not as particular about the soil as you might think. Certainly the common wildflowers anyway. Some of the rarer ones are much more picky and more fussy about where they will grow. So this is sowing now. So there's a few things to know about sowing. People often contact Plantlife in the spring. I guess they've come out in the garden for the first time, and they've suddenly thought, oh, we want to create a wildflower meadow. And they say, we're desperate, we need to do it really quickly, because they're worried about the weather getting warmer and warmer and drier and drier. And obviously trying to sow wildflowers in the middle of the summer when the ground is very dry is quite difficult. And we would probably say that actually trying to sow wildflowers in the spring now is quite challenging as well, because the weather is getting increasingly dry. We're getting very dry springs. And if you sow some plants, some seeds at this time of year, the likelihood is we'll get dry spell, and those little tiny seedlings will really struggle to get established. Other wildflowers also require cold weather. So some of the seeds that we might sow in a wildflower mix require the cold weather over the winter to help stimulate them to germinate. So we would generally recommend the best time of year to sow wildflowers is in the autumn or late summer, really, before the ground gets too wet. So what you're seeing there, I think that was sown in probably very early October. So we would probably say from sort of late August through September is probably the best time to try and sow wildflowers if you're trying to create a small area of wildflowers or a meadow in your garden, somewhere like that. And they're sowing there by hand, and the seeds have actually been mixed with sharp sand, and they're mixed inside the bucket. And one of the reasons we do that is so that we can see exactly where you've sown, because the sand will show up on the ground on the scarified meadow there, so you can see where you've sown. And it also just helps to distribute the seeds a little bit more evenly when you're trying to sow. A lot of seeds are quite light and they're quite easy just to kind of blow away. So it's best to try and do it on a day when it's not too windy either. And in a small area, it's really easy. You can just walk up and down and you can just scatter the seeds, provided you've done that creating of the bare ground, which you can see there in the photo. That really is the kind of, I guess, the key to making this all work, or at least to get the plants established in the first place. So this is the same area before any wildflowers were introduced. So, it's a fairly typical lawn. It already did have a few wildflowers in there. I think probably mostly maybe a few buttercups. I think I can see some dandelions there in the front of the lawn. Probably some daisies as well, but not a huge amount of wildflowers. And it had been like that for a long, long time. And there was a lot of thatch, and the grass, the grass was just cut on a regular basis. The lawn was just mown fairly frequently all the way through the summer. So it was decided that was a good starting point for trying to introduce some wildflowers. So this is the lawn after it's been scarified. It looks quite brutal. So pushing that machine, that scarifier up and down the lawn, and then raking off all of the grass and all the dead grass that came out. And you can see there's quite a lot of bare patches, but that's exactly what we want. We want those bare patches so that when we put the seed on, the seed is going to make contact with the soil, which will actually help the seed to germinate. If you don't do that, you're going to really struggle to get the seed to germinate. So that is really critical. So yes, scarify is a good one. Getting the mower really, really short and mowing repeatedly and lowering the mower as you go will do a similar job to the photo there. The other alternative way of doing it is to use a strimmer. You can use a strimmer with a cord on it, and again you can just keep strimming and strimming into the grass, and eventually you'll just kind of strim out the grass and you'll end up with some sort of bare kind of bald patches, which again are an ideal place to sow seeds into. I mean, another way as well potentially, but it's probably a lot more hard work, is using a spring rake that you might rake moss out of a lawn, and potentially you can create some bare patches doing like that. So it's hard work, but it's really, really critical to getting the seeds to get established. So that's the same place. This is probably taken around 6 weeks after that picture. So you see how quickly the grass grows back. Grass is really quite tough, which is why it always persists so well under all sorts of different management, and why it always grows back after being cut so well. So you may think from that photo that the grass, at first, I can't find that one, you may think that the grass would never grow back, but of course it does. It comes back very, very quickly. So grass is pretty tough, really. So why we can really be quite brutal with the grass at this stage when we're trying to get wildflowers established. So this is anyway probably 6 to 8 weeks after, so it's in the autumn. after that. So it may well actually been sort of October, November time, probably November-ish. And already you can see in there, you can't see, but I can see there's quite a lot of wildflowers have already started to germinate in those bare areas. And you can still see there's a few bare patches in there, which hopefully will persist right through till the spring, because some of the wildflowers will germinate in the spring, and particularly the yellow rattle, which requires cold weather over the winter to help it to stimulate its seed to germinate. So again, we often have people contacting us as a charity and saying, well, I sowed yellow rattle, and you ask and they say nothing grew, and you talk about, did they create the bare ground? They say yes, we created all the bare ground, and that was all as it should be. And then you say, when did you sow? And they said, oh, we sowed in the spring. And of course the problem is that the yellow rattle doesn't have cold enough weather in the spring to stimulate the seed to then germinate. So again, it's really important that you sow, if you're going to try and sow yellow rattle, that you sow it in the autumn, so it has a period of cold weather over the winter. And because we've created these bare patches in here, and because the grass has stayed quite short over the winter, when the yellow rattle starts to germinate, typically in sort of February, March, there's enough sunlight getting down onto the soil and onto those bare patches, and then the yellow rattle just gets away really quickly, and it's really good. So it's the best way to get rattle established in a small area as well. So this was the following spring. You can start to see some of the wildflowers in there now. We can see quite a lot of vetches, see lots of, we can see some yarrow in there, we can see some knapweed in there as well, just starting to grow. But often in the first year of a wildflower meadow, so if you've tried to create a small area of a meadow in a garden or in another green space, you won't necessarily see that many plants flowering, mainly because a lot of these plants that we're trying to get going are our native perennial wildflowers. So those are the ones that will do best in a wildflower meadow. Quite a lot of people and quite a lot of meadow mixes will often have annuals in them, such as cornflowers and poppies, and they would grow in that first year because we've created bare ground and we've sown them. And if there were annual flowers in that mix, but there weren't, you would see some of those plants. And typically they will survive for a year or maybe two. But of course, meadows, our wildflower meadows in the wider countryside, are a combination of grass and mostly perennial wildflowers. The annual flowers, such as the poppies and the cornflowers, are flowers that are associated with arable landscapes. So where the ground is annually being cultivated, and those plants are adapted to that kind of lifestyle. So they do very well where the soil is always being cultivated every single year, and they have to grow again from seed. So they typically won't survive if you sow them as part of a meadow mix for more than a year or two. But of course, what we're getting here and what we're trying to get established are the perennial wildflowers. As I say, you won't get so many in the first year, but in year 3, 4, and 5, you'll start to get a whole range of these wildflowers flowering and doing much better. So that's the sort of basic approach to trying to create a wildflower area. And then the management obviously is the key. So once you've got those wildflowers established, it's thinking about the management, and you've got those two options really in a garden context. It's managing it as it is a mini hay meadow, so that's leaving it all the way through the spring. So probably you do your last cut in the autumn. If you're lucky, you might be able to get another really early cut maybe in February if the ground's dry enough. And then you don't do any cutting really until probably mid to late summer. So you allow all of those plants to grow up long and flower and do their thing and set their seed, and then you cut it and you remove it, which is kind of mimicking how a hay meadow would have been managed in the wider countryside. And that tends to favour a lot of our native wildflowers, that kind of management. So if it's possible to create an area where you can let it grow up very long, that's the best bet. The alternative is that infrequent cutting with a mower and cutting and collecting maybe every 4 to 6 weeks. And that will favour some of the lower growing flowers, like some of the vetches, the bird's foot trefoil, the self-heal, and some of the clovers, the red and white clovers as well. So they will do really well if you're just doing that more infrequent cutting and removing. So those are your two real main options to get wildflowers going in a garden. And generally they can be really successful in gardens because of some of the reasons we talked about already. Another thing that Plantlife is doing, and some of you may or may not have picked up on this over the last couple of years, we launched a campaign about 2 years ago called Every Flower Counts. It's a citizen science campaign. It's a little bit like the Great Garden Birdwatch for plants. And we're encouraging people to let their meadows or their gardens or their lawns grow long. So not cut your lawn through May and through June. And then we're asking people to go and count the wildflowers in their lawns in June and July. And we've got lots and lots. This campaign is, well, this year will be its 3rd year. And we're encouraging people to sign up to this campaign, and we're encouraging people to try and leave their lawns long and see what wildflowers might appear in your lawn. If you've never done that before, it's a really interesting exercise just to see what will appear. So you can sign up to this campaign and to this project. We've got a website up and running, and if you search online for Every Flower Counts, you'll come across this website. And this kind of really works if you're able to leave your lawn and let it grow long through May and into June as well. So yeah, I mean, we really encourage as many people to sign up and let their lawns grow through May. And then if you want to sign up to this project, we will contact you and send you all the information and all the details about what you've got to do. But what we're doing is really trying to get people looking in their lawns to see how many wildflowers there might be growing in a typical lawn. But of course, they're all being cut away because people are constantly cutting their lawns. And then the idea is that people will start to record those plants, and we're looking for a lot of the common wildflowers that you would expect to see in a lawn. So we've put together some identification sheets for people. So if you sign up to this project, we will email you all of this information, and you can download these identification sheets. And then, yeah, we would like you to start looking for some of these plants in your lawn if you've left it to grow long. So what we're asking people to do is literally try and do this in a fairly randomized way in their lawn. The suggested way is to throw a tennis ball into your lawn, and wherever that lands is the area that you're going to look at, and you're going to try and identify some of the wildflowers in the list, in the ID sheets that we give you. And then basically what we're trying to get people to do is look within a sort of roughly in a metre square. So using some canes is quite a good way just to kind of identify an area that you're going to try and record the wildflowers, and record them on those sheets, and then you can upload that information to the website, and the website will then give you a nectar score. So it will tell you how many bees the wildflowers in your garden potentially could support if you weren't constantly cutting it every couple of weeks. So, and it's really interesting when we start to look across the country at the number of people that have signed up to this scheme, and we realise how many wildflowers there are in many of our lawns and many of our gardens that are just constantly being cut, and the potential value of those lawns in terms of their pollination, value for insects and for bees and other insects as well. So it's a huge resource really that we're kind of just cutting and cutting. And potentially that could look absolutely beautiful and could support a whole load of wildflowers and a whole load of insects at the same time. So yeah, so we really encourage people to try and sign up for that. So if you search for Every Flower Counts, we'd love you to take part in that scheme. So again, there's quite a lot of other potential wildflowers that you might want to think about planting in a garden context as well. So we've also got another website that's run by Plantlife, which is really around the idea of wildflower gardening. And there's some really useful and valuable resources on there for people to try and help them to identify some of the best plants that you could plant in a more garden context, in a more formal garden context, that can be beneficial to wildlife as well. So again, if you search for Wildflower Garden Plantlife on Google, you should come across this website, and then you can actually put in different bits of information about the space you might have. You can put in the types of plants you might want to try and grow, whether it's shady and when you want them to flower, and then it will kind of populate with a list of possible plants that are really good for wildlife. So that's a really good, useful resource as well for people to try. So yeah, so again, have a look around on there, and hopefully there's some useful information to try and encourage you to get more creative about how you use the space that you might have available to you for wildflowers. that's probably all I really want to say tonight. I just want to say also that Plantlife is a charity, and obviously we're supported by donations from members of the public and from our membership as well. And we also have lots of social media channels. So if you're a social media person, and we'd really encourage you to follow us on Twitter or on Facebook, and you can find out more about some of these schemes and these projects, and you can find out more about Wildflowers. And our website as well has got a lot more information on it as well. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. Absolutely fascinating. I think I'm going to have to look at my garden slightly differently in the future. We've got some fantastic questions, but before we turn to those, just like to say, you're talking about bees and the impact of having a great wildflower meadow on our insects. It's so important. And the next talk in our series is on the wonderful world of bees on the 20th of May. So great opportunity for everyone to sign up for that through the Wessex Museum's website. So that's the other end of the sausage machine. And that's also sponsored by Strategic Solutions. So we're going to turn to questions now, if you're happy to take them.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. We've got some coming through on the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen, and we've had some through on the chat as well. So Kathy and I are going to look after the questions between us. So do start putting them in. I'll start with one from Rachel, who has said, we have a field with paddocks and some grazing sheep, 9 of them. Says something about the size of the paddock. How can we have some wildflower meadows alongside grazing?
Okay. There's several different things there to think about. Wildflower meadows generally do best when there's grazing is removed at certain times of the year, because if you can imagine having sheep in a pasture or in a meadow for most of the year, they will kind of nibble most things, and often fields that have sheep in are quite tightly cut or tightly grazed, and they almost look like lawns sometimes if you've got quite a number of sheep in them. So it can be quite tricky if you haven't got anywhere else to put your sheep, because if they stay in that meadow the whole season, it's going to limit the potential for getting wildflowers growing. I mean, the likelihood is that your meadow or your paddock may well have wildflowers in it already. It's just that they're probably being nibbled, and you won't see them flowering because of the sheep. So I suppose what we would say is there any opportunity to take the sheep away from the meadow? Have you got anywhere else you could put them? Or maybe could you make the meadow, half the meadow some way, so that you could actually just exclude them from a part of the meadow, so you could try and get wildflowers growing in a part? I mean, what we'd probably say is actually just exclude them from an area for temporarily through the summer, and then see if you have got any wildflowers in there, and then put them back in to graze in the autumn. So typically, if you're managing a pasture with sheep or cattle, you would normally graze in the autumn if you're trying to get more wildflower meadows. Or more wildflowers. And of course, in a farm, that might be easier because you can move the livestock into a different field, and you can exclude them from grazing it during the sort of early summer when the wildflowers are growing. So it can be quite tricky if you've only got one place, one paddock.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Matt. Really interesting. I've been doing things wrong all my life, obviously, because I have been planting in the spring and also just scattering seeds on the ground. So I've learned a lot tonight, but loads of questions that I've picked up here. And one is quite interesting. It's a comment actually made by Brian to say that on Meridian News tonight, there was a feature all about artificial lawns and how these are taking over. They're getting really popular. So it's a comment on what do you think about artificial lawns, but also can you mitigate? I mean, if you had tubs or something with wildflowers, or what do you think?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could, yeah, I mean, clearly we wouldn't approve of artificial lawns. And they're not great for insects. They're not really good for wildflowers, are they? I mean, I can understand why people might just want to not have the hassle of cutting their lawn. But I mean, we would say that if you leave your lawn as a wildflower meadow, you've got much less hassle cutting it anyway, because you don't have to cut it as frequently as you might a typical lawn. So it's just once a year, and in a small space, that's way less onerous. but yeah, I mean, you can certainly grow wildflowers in much smaller spaces, and you know, if you, I mean, particularly, I mean, you wouldn't typically use compost. You might try and use soil, and you might just, you know, you could fill a box up with soil, or you could fill a tub up with soil, and you could certainly get wildflowers. I mean, wildflowers tend to do best in poor soil, so you wouldn't feed them at all. So you know, so using just soil from the ground is probably best, to be honest. And you could sow seeds straight into that in the autumn. And yeah, and you could absolutely get flowers established in a small space, in a window box, in a trough, or in a pot or something in the garden. I guess the bigger the better, really. But yeah.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. And I've got one from Eleanor. She's asked a couple of really good and interesting ones. She's got a small garden and children, which is always a challenge. What could we do? What plants would be best?
What plants? What wildflowers?
Wildflowers, yes.
I mean, some of the easiest ones to get going are oxeye daisies. You can buy the seed of oxeye. Some of the wildflowers also you can buy just as individual species. So if you go onto the Plantlife website, but you know, there are other websites where you can buy individual wildflower species. You know, just a packet of, say, oxeye daisies. Or say something like knapweed. I mean, I guess you want to get things going that are quite easy to establish and will grow easily. I mean, I would also, you know, the yellow rattle is a really easy plant to get going as well. So, but you typically would need to grow that in a grassy area. But it grows quite quickly, and because it's an annual, it grows and flowers all in the first year, and it's quite a fun thing for kids to watch. And also, you can then collect the seed from it. Which you can then use to kind of sow elsewhere, maybe, or move around. So that's quite a nice plant, and it just grows really quickly, and you can see it all happening in the same year. So it's a good fun plant, I think, for kids to watch, because some of the other wildflowers take a bit longer to get going, and they may not flower in the first year. So it can be a little bit. Sometimes people get a little disheartened by that. So.
Thanks, Matt. I've got another one here that came from Aileen. So she said she lives in a 1990s house on an estate, which used to be field or farmland. So she thinks it would be good for wildflower lawns, but the lawn is at the front of the house, and she thinks neighbours might complain if she leaves the grass really long. So is there a balance here? What do you suggest?
What we tend to, what I think what's worked through people doing this and talking about this to us and to other people is that often, you're right, people do sometimes think, oh, it's a mess, oh, it looks neglected, they must be ill because they're not cutting their lawn, and you know, you often get these kind of comments coming out from people, and what tends to allay people's, not necessarily fears, but people's concerns about it looking messy is you just mow around it. You mow a little kind of almost like a frame, like a border around your meadow, because then it kind of looks like you've deliberately done it rather than kind of just abandoned it. And it's just that simple thing of mowing a kind of just one strip with your mower quite frequently around it, so that it kind of looks deliberate, makes people think, oh, okay, they must be doing that for a reason, you know, rather than they've just left it alone for no reason. So surprising, just that kind of tiny little change can make a difference to people's perceptions. And I think most people, when they start to see wildflowers that up close, they suddenly go, oh, actually, this does look quite nice, you know. And I think it's as much about trying to change people's perceptions as much as anything. So I would, that's what I would do if you're able to do it. And I think you might have a few people initially saying grumbling, but I suspect you'll have more people commenting in a positive way than you will have grumbling. Certainly in my experience, that's what tends to happen. So,
and put some Plantlife posters up.
Yeah. Exactly. Tell them to search online as to the reasons you're doing it. So,
question from Christina: how can we balance modern farming practice and the food requirements of a growing population against the need for diverse habitats in the landscape, both key to our survival?
That sounds like some sort of university thesis, that one, doesn't it? That's an easy question to answer. I mean, I kind of didn't go into much detail about farming. I kind of was a bit negative about farming, but clearly, I mean, a lot of work has happened in the countryside over the last 20 years through changing farming practice, you know, some of it for the worse, but some of it for the better. And government has been supporting farmers to recreate habitats. to restore wildflower meadows and recreate other habitats as well across the farmed landscape. So, and this has mainly been through what they call the agri-environment scheme. So things like countryside stewardship, if anyone's heard of that, which is basically paying farmers to restore and recreate habitats, and wildflower meadows are part of that. So, lots of good work has happened, and I kind of bash farmers, and farmers have, I guess, been, they're in a tricky position, because you're right that it's a farming business. They do need to produce food, and and they have to derive an income, a livelihood from the land. So, and historically they have been pulled and pushed by different policies and different government initiatives over the years. So I suppose, interestingly, what's happening now as a result of us leaving the European Union, we're kind of, the UK's kind of rural and environmental policy is being reshaped, and farmers are going to be encouraged they're going to be encouraged through incentives to provide public goods, which is a grand way of saying create wildlife habitats, which would be considered public goods in terms of for the public, and more incentives are going to be put in for farmers and landowners to do that. So the likelihood is that's probably going to have a more positive effect across the countryside in terms of putting some of this habitat back. But it is a challenge sometimes to try and manage a traditional wildflower meadow in a modern farming system. But there is other things going on in agriculture as well. People are looking much more at how they manage their land in a more sensitive manner, thinking about reducing the amount of herbicides and pesticides, and they're looking at the idea of how the soil and how certain plants can actually help us improve fertility. So if you plant the right kinds of flowers in a meadow, in an agricultural meadow, you can actually increase the productivity of that meadow without using artificial fertilizers. The term regenerative agriculture is what you might have heard, and this approach to trying to diversify pasture for livestock is something that's kind of being taken up more widely by farmers, and I think probably that will increase over the coming years when we start to think about how we reduce our carbon footprint and how we mitigate against climate change. So actually using plants more cleverly, we can still have productivity, but we can also benefit wildlife and biodiversity at the same time. So I think some of these things are starting to come together in a farm, and you can still have a more you can still have a commercial farming business, but you can also benefit wildlife at the same time. So there's interesting things going on in the farming space at the moment.
A couple of questions here. One from Chris saying he's got loads of dandelions on his lawn and not much else. Is that a problem? Okay. How can he suppress them? What is the situation there?
I think dandelions this year are doing really well because it's dry. And dandelions are actually quite a deep-rooted plant. So, of course, the grass around them is quite shallow-rooted. And so the grass is not growing very quickly. I mean, in most places at the moment, the grass is quite short because it just hasn't grown very much, particularly where grass has been left uncut, particularly in verges and on meadows and other green spaces. It's still quite, and it's been cold as well. So, and of course, the dandelions have done well because they've got a deep root and they're an early flowering plant anyway. I wouldn't worry about having too many dandelions. I mean, they're an early flowering plant that has good nectar for some of the bees that are coming out at this time of year. They're not a problem, they're just part of the plant community in a wildflower meadow. And of course, as the other plants start to grow taller, they'll still be there, but they start to disappear into the background a bit. If you haven't got many other wildflowers in your area, the lawn or whatever, where we're talking about, I mean, you've got the potential to think about going through the process we described. So that idea of scratching up the soil in the autumn and then trying to establish wildflowers in there, and that's probably what we would recommend if there's very little else in your lawn. But I would still say probably the best thing to do if you've never left it to grow long through a whole season, I would still encourage you to do that first, just in case, because you might find there are more wildflowers in there than you realise.
And Joanne has asked a question on any tips on how to discourage stinging nettles from taking over on the newly seeded area.
I mean, stinging nettles tend to grow well where the soil is quite enriched and it's quite fertile. So, and again, it's probably quite a challenge to establish wildflowers on very fertile soil. Wildflowers, as I said, tend to do better on poorer, less fertile soil. In terms of discouraging wild stinging nettles, I guess the only option really probably, if you're not going to use chemicals, which we would obviously generally discourage people from using chemicals as much as possible, is digging them up or cutting them frequently. And over time, if you cut them frequently, you will start to reduce them and other things will start to come in and take their place. But if the soil is fertile and if the soil has been disturbed, and sometimes around the bases of hedges and other areas where you've had disturbance, nettles are often a thing that are quite a challenge to get rid of. And of course, nettles are really valuable for quite a lot of things. I mean, quite a lot of butterflies will use them, but caterpillars will lay their eggs on them. Yeah, so other insects will use them as well as a source of nectar and pollen. So they're not, although they might look as pretty as some of our other wildflowers, they are actually a valuable source for insects. And yeah.
Thanks, Matt. So we're getting lots of comments. People are loving the idea of mowing borders and different patterns into the lawn to get that kind of arty look to it.
And of course, you want to enjoy your wildflowers, don't you? So, cutting a path right through the middle of your patch. I mean, why not? I mean, you want to be able to get out there and you want to look around it and you want to walk it and you want other people to appreciate it too. So I think, we shouldn't, part of the reason we're doing this is for ourselves, isn't it? Because we like how they look.
Absolutely. Well, that leads on to the next question.
No shame in admitting that.
Yeah. So Sammy wants to know what your favourite flower is.
My favourite flower, okay. Probably Betony, I think. And Betony is one of these flowers. It's not massively uncommon, but it's also potentially only in some of our better meadows. I think I had a photo of it right at the beginning on a road verge at the very beginning of the slides. It's one of those plants that's quite slow to spread. It's very beautiful. It's a late flowering plant, and it generally is an indicator of old pasture. So if you've got Betony somewhere in your meadow or on your road verge or in your churchyard or anywhere, it would generally suggest that that's probably been pasture or meadow for a very, very long time, because it's just a very slow plant to spread, and it's not easy to get it established from seed. It's quite hard to grow from seed. So it tends to just be you often see it on road verges, because road verges clearly are really old.
Brilliant, thank you.
Interesting question here. If we get people in our town to sign up to No Mow May and the Wildflower Hunt, is there a way we can get the response wildflower survey data from the surveys from Plantlife?
Yeah, well, yeah, what you mean, the actual species?
Yeah, I think, or just to see what the distribution is across the town.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, we do. We publish all that information. So I mean, basically, it's every flower counts. It's not the Wildflower Hunt. So the campaign that's just about to launch at the end of this week is called No Mow May, and then every flower counts. So yeah, I mean, if you sign up to that scheme on the website and you input you record the plants in your area, in your patch, whether it be, it doesn't have to be a lawn, it could be in a public space somewhere if there's an area that's being left, or it could be in a meadow, or it could be in your paddock. It doesn't really matter wherever it is, wherever you've got wildflowers, you can do it. But we do publish all those results at the end of the year. So yeah, I think last year's results are still on the website actually for that. So, and we're trying to build up, over the years, we're trying to get a better understanding about these spaces, these lawns and these green spaces, and the potential they have for wildflowers. So yeah, you're kind of adding to a bigger picture really by signing up to one of these, a bit like you would do when you sign up to the Garden Bird Watch. So it's valuable information for us.
Time's getting on now, so I'm squeezing a few more questions, but I presume that if people look on the Plantlife website anyway, they can find lots of this information for themselves or ask questions, no doubt. But I've another one from you here, which is from Richard, and he says they have a community green on an old water meadow beside a chalk river. Any suggestions for that?
I'm assuming it's somewhere in Wiltshire or Hampshire. Not sure. It wouldn't be Hampshire, would it? Because you're not going into Hampshire generally. How big an area do you cover with the museums?
We're mainly Dorset and Wiltshire.
Okay, so presumably it's somewhere in Wiltshire, perhaps.
But there have been people on the call from.
Okay, there are people all over. Okay, I mean, without seeing it, it's quite tricky. I mean, what I would suggest, if people have got other questions that are probably not necessarily easy to answer in this kind of forum, is you can basically send an inquiry to Plantlife. So we have an email address, and it's meadows@plantlife.org.uk. So you'd be very welcome to just drop us a line if you've got a question that is not answered here, or is probably, I mean, something like that is a bit more complex probably to just give you some sort of glib, quick answer. But I'd be happy to have a conversation about it in a bit more detail with you. Yeah, I mean, because generally, if we're trying to give advice about an area that we would try and want to find out as much as we possibly can about that area and what it's like and how it's been managed and what the plants are before giving general advice. In a garden context, it's perhaps slightly different because you've got a bit more flexibility in a garden about
Brilliant.
what you do.
Thank
And most people know their gardens quite well, don't they? Because they're constantly looking at them. So, yeah.
Okay, two very practical questions. One is, when seeding are lightly cultivated in autumn, would you leave seed on the surface or rake in lightly? And the plug plants worth doing? And then I think we'll just have one final question.
Two really good questions, actually. Yeah. So the seeding is definitely just scatter it on the surface. Doesn't need to be buried at all. If you think about how wildflowers operate in the wild, those seeds basically fall out of the plants typically in sort of late July and into August, and they just fall onto the ground. And if they're lucky, they fall onto some bare ground, and then they germinate. So we're just kind of speeding up the process really by creating that bare ground in a grassy area. And it just gives us a bit more certainty that those seeds are going to germinate because they're going to be falling onto some bare ground. You could trample it to try and just push the seeds so that they make contact with the soil, but they don't need to be buried. So yeah, just walking up and down over an area, or if you've got like a garden roller or something like that, you can just kind of roll it. That will help just to kind of press the seeds in, just so that they make really good contact with the soil. So that can help as well, but it's not essential. And the other question was about plant plugs, wasn't it?
Plugs.
Yeah. I mean, again, plugs can be successful. Again, we would encourage people to plant plugs in the autumn rather than in the spring. People often buy them and chuck them in the spring, and of course the ground gets dry. Look at what's happened this year, and this is not the first year we've had a really dry early spring, and the likelihood is we'll probably have there's no massive amounts of rain forecast for the next month or two. You're basically making a rod for your own back if you try and plant them in the spring, because you're then having to constantly run a hose out and water them. So if you plant them in the autumn, they're just going to get their feet down, they're going to get their roots down into the ground better. They're going to get more established over the autumn, and then by the spring they'll be better. So it's generally more reliable to sow them or plant them in the autumn, I think. And again, you probably want to plant them when the ground has softened up slightly. So you might want to wait till sort of October, November, so it's a bit easier to actually dig a hole before you plant plugs. And ideally, you probably want to kind of create a little bit of space around those plugs. So if you're planting them in a field, in an area that's got grass in it, you might want to literally just take out a spade's width of turf, and you could invert that turf where the grass is, and then you could plant the plug in the middle of that sort of square of turf, and that will just give it a little bit of it'll help it in the first year or so. It'll mean it's got slightly less competition, so it's not trying to compete with the grass so much. So that's generally a good tip.
Great practical advice.
I'll just do a last question for me, I think, before we wrap up. Peter says that he had lots of oxeye daisies in his garden for years, and suddenly they've disappeared. Have you got any idea why that might happen?
Oxeye daisies are not a particularly long-lived flower, anyway. They also need some bare ground to seed back into. So if his meadowy area has got very little bare ground, and those plants are flowering and those seeds are not falling back onto some bare ground, the likelihood is they might disappear over time. So they often come back in if you make a bit of disturbance. So it might just be worth doing a bit of raking around in the area where they were last, because I suspect there's probably some seed that may have fallen out from previous years. And if you can kind of create a bit of that bare ground again, or a bit of disturbance in the area in the autumn, the likelihood is you might find that they might pop back up again, especially if they've only been missing for a very brief period, maybe a year or two.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matt. I'd just like to thank you. I'll pass on to David now to wrap up, but that's been brilliant. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for listening.
A very big thank you to Matt and to everyone who's come tonight. I'm sure we're all inspired to go and do something very different with our lawns. I know I am. And a reminder again of the next talk in the series, Wonderful World of Bees, on the 20th of May. You can book through the Wessex Museum's website. Big thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to those of you who have come and asked such interesting questions. And again, a big thank you to Matt and Plantlife. So with that, we'll